teacup endlessly full, but never poured. Welcome to Mystery's Notebook. I am your host, Elspeth. Tell me in the comments where you're tuning in. I treasure reading each of your notes. The story starts now. It was one of those afternoons St. Mary Mead excelled at producing. Sunlight spilling like warm honey across the village green, bees humming lazily over the lavender borders, and the clink of teacups faintly audible from open windows. The Reverend Leonard Clement's garden, however, was the true centre of activity that day. Under the shade of a vast horse chestnut, a collection of white-painted iron chairs and tables had been arranged with military precision for the annual church tea. The scent of scones and strawberry jam floated over the lawn, mingling with the sharper note of fresh-cut grass. At the far table, Mrs. Bantry, formidable in both hat and opinion, presided over the teapot as if it were an altar, dispensing tea with all the ceremony of a high mass. "It's the third pot this afternoon," she declared to anyone within earshot. "I've never known such thirst in a parish. Must be the heat." Miss Marple, seated unobtrusively at the edge of the gathering, took a small sip from her own cup. She wore her pale blue summer dress with a straw hat whose ribbon had faded a little at the edges. Her eyes, however, were as alert as ever, following the small dramas playing out on the lawn. She noticed the discreet but telling way Mrs. Ellison refilled only her own cup before passing the pot along. She noticed the subtle lean-in between Mr. Denning and the young Miss Clara Godfrey, their conversation punctuated with shared glances. And she noticed, because she always did, the solitary place at the far end of the table where a cup of tea sat cooling beside an untouched slice of seed cake. "That's for Mr. Pritchard," Mrs. Bantry said when Miss Marple's eyes rested on it. "He's gone to fetch his spectacles from the hall, fussy about the crossword." But minutes passed, and Mr. Pritchard did not return. Conversation carried on in the soft rhythm of village talk, complaints about the price of sugar, the new postmistress's handwriting, the rumours about the hall being sold. And then, quite suddenly, there was a small, strangled sound from behind the rose trellis. The Reverend's wife, Griselda, was the first to move. She stepped beyond the trellis and gave a startled cry. Chairs scraped, teacups rattled. By the time half the guests had followed, they found her standing rigid, pointing toward the narrow path that led to the tool shed. There lay Mr. Pritchard, sprawled awkwardly on the gravel, his spectacles in one hand, the other clutching at his chest. His hat had rolled to the edge of the flower bed, and beside it, quite incongruously, was a second teacup, full to the brim, steam curling faintly into the warm air. "Oh dear," murmured Miss Marple, arriving at the scene with unhurried steps. Her eyes flicked once from the fallen man to the teacup, then to the cluster of faces around her, pale, shocked, and just a shade too eager to see what had happened. No one noticed her gaze linger on the tea, nor the faint trace of jam along the rim, as though someone had drunk deeply, then filled it again. Griselda, always quicker in a crisis than her husband, sent the maid for Dr. Haydock, and, with the gentle authority of someone who had arranged more church fetes than anyone could count, persuaded the crowd back toward the tables and shade. The movement itself was a kind of relief. Chairs scraped, hats resettled. The murmur of talk swelled at once, and then dipped to a whisper, as if a curtain had fallen between the rose trellis and the rest of the garden. Miss Marple, with the slight stoop of age that made people forget she observed more keenly than any of them, did not return to her seat immediately. She looked down at the second teacup by Mr. Pritchard's hand. The steam was already less than a minute ago, but still present. The surface trembled with the faintest ring where a drop from the spout had struck. It was, she thought, far too full for a man to have carried along the gravel path without spilling. She had once watched Colonel Melchett attempt the same turn, cup in hand, and the saucer had worn half the tea by the end of it. She noticed, too, the gleam of strawberry jam on the cup's rim. Not a smear of the greedy or careless sort. No, this was a crescent, the thin telling arc that showed the cup had been lifted, sipped from, and then filled again. One saw such marks on Good Housekeeping mornings, when well-meaning helpers poured hot tea over the remains of an earlier cup to freshen it. Someone had tried freshness here. Her eyes moved to the untouched slice of seed cake at the far table, the twin of the one near the empty place, still perfect, still emitting that buttery, nutty sweetness over which Mrs. Bantry prided herself. Mr. Pritchard's appetite had been widely considered regular. He never neglected seed cake. Yet he had left his slice. No, he had never even taken it. That's what the untouched wedge implied, and gone for his spectacles. And in between, a second suspicious cup had found him. The garden did what English gardens do under strain. It pretended to be ordinary. The bees went on with their business. The sun pressed kindly on the white paint of the iron chairs. And at the nearest table, Mrs. Bantry gathered people and cup handles with the same briskness. "We shall wait for the doctor," she announced with a firmness that did not entirely cover her shaking hands. "No wandering off to the tool shed. The Reverend will say a prayer." Leonard Clement obliged with a brief, gentle petition. Grief sat on his voice like a soft weight. He was a man who disliked making a spectacle of sorrow. When he finished, conversation sprang back with that guilty, eager speed peculiar to villages. Little bursts of theory, recollection, and grievance, all dressed as sympathy. "Poor man. His heart, I shouldn't wonder," said Mrs. Ellison, eyeing the tray nearest her. "He complained of a tightness only last Sunday. I noticed it at once." "Did you, dear?" murmured Griselda, arriving with a napkin for a trembling Miss Hart, the new postmistress, who had taken the whole business rather badly. "I confess I never heard a word of it." Mrs. Ellison accepted the correction with a pinch to her lips and poured herself another cup. It was not that she hoarded the pot exactly, but her wrist made a neat deflecting angle whenever anyone else lifted a hand. Miss Marple admired the economy of it. She had seen Mrs. Ellison's like before, at church socials and wartime cues, the sort who believes without malice that rationing is for others. Mr. Denning, the estate agent with the carefully casual tie, sat a little apart with Miss Clara Godfrey. Their heads seemed to find each other as willow leaves do in a faint wind. Clara's all too large eyes were full of tearful concern, very pretty in their earnestness. "I spoke to Mr. Pritchard not half an hour ago," she said. "About the hall, the inquiries. He did get rather flushed, you know. I asked if he needed air." "Flushed because you pressed him," Denning muttered, only for Clara's ear. But the murmurs behind one's back at a church tea have a way of curving round. Miss Marple heard the word hall drop onto the grass between them, like something shiny and awkward. The hall had been poised for sale or rescue depending on whom you asked. If Mr. Denning was the agent, and Clara the companion to poor Lady Averil, who, depending on rumour, had already agreed to let the West Wing during the season, then Mr. Pritchard, treasurer of the church committee and general guardian of the village purse strings, had likely had opinions. He had been a man of the kind who carry decimals in their heads and distrust promises measured in adjectives. "It is heat," Miss Hart whispered, to no one and everyone, pressing the napkin into her cheeks. "People do collapse in heat. Only last year my uncle's neighbour—" "Heat does many things," Mrs. Bantry said, "but it does not pour tea out by the rose walk." This sent a little shiver along the table. Griselda glanced at her. "Dolly." "Oh, I'm not being dramatic, Griselda. I merely observe. The teapot is here. Mr. Pritchard was there." She nodded toward the trellis. "If he wanted tea, why did he not drink it where tea is?" "That is just it," said Leonard, his clerical habit of fairness warring with alarm. "We mustn't speculate. Dr. Haydock will—" Dr. Haydock's sturdy stride on the gravel felt like a verdict even before he knelt by the body. He lifted Mr. Pritchard's wrist, touched the throat, peered with professional impatience at the face and tongue. "Gone," he said, not unkindly. "A matter of minutes. No more." "His heart?" asked three voices in different keys. "Possibly," said Haydock. "He was not in my keeping. More's the pity. You all know how he disliked doctors. But I am not fond of pronouncements under a horse-chestnut tree. Inspector Slack will wish his look. I'll send from the surgery." If you would be so good as to keep everyone here. He glanced about. And please, no more tea. At this last, something like a gasp went around. It is one thing to witness sudden death. It is another to have one's tea taken away. Miss Marple, who understood that people face loss most bravely when their fingers held to habit, felt the soft, embarrassed guilt of agreeing with him. She watched as the cups were quietly nudged aside. Even Mrs. Ellison set her own down with a reluctant clink that said she had been about to lift it. Inspector Slack arrived with less ceremony than the doctor, bringing an air of competence that usually soothed and sometimes provoked. Today, it did both. He took statements in brisk sketches, his pencil marching. He listened to the Reverend and Griselda without interrupting, to Mrs. Bantry with interruptions, and to Miss Hart with sufficient patience to extract a name or two from the fog. When he reached Miss Marple, he allowed the faintest smile, respect born of past experience, mixed with the hope she might be napping this time. You saw nothing directly, Miss Marple. I rarely see anything directly, Inspector. It is a fault of age. I notice only the edges of things. Her voice had the mildness of milk. For instance, that cup by poor Mr. Pritchard's hand. Very full. Men do not, in my experience, carry such full cups across gravel without baptizing their trousers. And there, no splash. Slack's pencil paused. Meaning? Oh, merely that the cup was poured where it lies, not carried there. That seems a little domestic for a sudden failure of the heart. Slack frowned briefly, then softened it with a note. Who had charge of the pot? This, of course, presented an opportunity. 4 people spoke at once, 3 of them to nominate Mrs. Bantry with the politeness of those who wish to nominate someone else. Mrs. Bantry met the accusation as she met everything. I poured for most, naturally. I refilled the pot twice. Mrs. Ellison took a turn when my wrist tired. I do pour neatly, Mrs. Ellison said, in the tone of one who is forced to defend a talent. But I did not take a pot down the path to the roses for private ceremonies. Certainly not for Mr. Pritchard. He was not among my immediate circle. And Mr. Pritchard's own cup? Slack asked, glancing at the empty place and the cooling tea there. He sat there. Indeed, Griselda said. He went in for his spectacles. His crossword, you know. He was rather methodical about it. Methodical, repeated Slack, as if the word might confess more if it saw its own reflection twice. He leaves his tea untouched, goes for spectacles, and is found behind the trellis with a second cup, full. Why would he take another when the first waits? A small silence trembled. It was so obvious when spoken that it felt impertinent to answer, like pointing out that someone had 2 left gloves. People looked at the table, at their hands, at anything but the path. Miss Marple felt the rhythm of the afternoon shift. The first gentle justification, heart, heat, chance, had been offered and found too thin. Now minds turned to people. Was he worried of late? Slack asked the Reverend. Opposed to anything? Any quarrels? Quarrels, no, Leonard said. He had opinions about the hall, about the choir fund, about, well, everything. Treasure the man who keeps accounts, Mrs. Bantry put in. We all spent happily and then let Mr. Pritchard worry later. He worried beautifully. If he were to go and die of something, I should have chosen constipation rather than the heart. Dolly, Griselda murmured. Slack ignored the embroidery, as was wise. The hall then. Denning, Miss Godfrey. Denning's jaw had set itself defensively, but he kept his voice smooth. Yes, we discussed timing. There's a party from London with serious interest, and another, well, an academic consortium, if you can credit it. Mr. Pritchard considered both offers a social danger, though in different ways. He preferred some sort of local trust, which, forgive me, is a charming idea for which no one could find the money. Clara's hands twisted in her lap. He thought I pressed Lady Averill beyond kindness. I didn't. I only, well, she cannot maintain the roof, Inspector. The rain comes in. You can't imagine the buckets last November. Plenty of people can imagine buckets, Miss Bantry said. We all live under roofs, dear. Any other disagreements? Slack said. Money missing. Whispered improprieties. The choir boys stealing hymnals. It was meant to be dry, yet the question shook loose more than anyone expected. Miss Hart, cheeks blotchy but eyes brighter now, the way some people are after a good cry, said, There was that matter at the post office, sir. Mr. Pritchard returned a money order last week, most particular about the signature. He said it looked not quite true. Whose order? Slack asked. She hesitated. I oughtn't say, but since you do ask, Mrs. Ellison's nephew's. It was made out to her, a small thing only. He's between positions, poor lad. Mrs. Ellison stiffened, colour rising delicately but decisively. An administrative muddle. The boy's handwriting is artistic, that is all. Artistic handwriting, murmured Mrs. Bantry, who enjoyed arranging words in amusing shapes. I have known many between positions who were the very Picassos of ink. It was nothing, Mrs. Ellison repeated, too quickly for nothing. Slack wrote, slow and large. Miss Marple studiously looked down at her gloves. She had seen it often. The small embarrassments that send out larger currents. People will endure scandal better than humiliation. A refused money order can sour a week. Dr. Haydock returned briefly to say that the coroner would be informed and that yes, the police might wish to keep the garden undisturbed. Slack set a constable by the trellis, young Reed, freckled and earnest, and then directed the slow drift of people toward the hall for statements. It was hardly a crowd control peril. They were a parish, not a mob. Still, the lane of rose-scented air between table and shed became a narrow sensation no one wished to pass through. Miss Marple stayed seated at the table with the cooling slice of seed cake and the cooling cup, as if minding them for their rightful owner. Griselda paused by her shoulder. Jane, you look as though you're thinking of someone's pantry. I am thinking of someone's habits, Miss Marple said. Mr. Pritchard was a careful man. He ate first, then drank. He did not like his tea hot. He said it scalded the understanding. And yet, there lies a cup very hot indeed, and very full by his poor hand. Meaning he did not pour it for himself. Meaning that someone poured for him, and someone who knows the trick of refreshing a cup to hide the taste of what was in it before. Griselda's eyes widened. Jane. Oh, I haven't said poison, Miss Marple replied mildly, as if discussing a stubborn geranium. One ought never to declare something horrid until the doctor does. I only say that in my experience, there are people who think ill luck looks better in a fresh cup. Across the lawn, Mrs. Ellison, conscious of eyes, though none were upon her directly, adjusted her hat. Mr. Denning spoke too cheerfully to Clara, whose answers grew shorter. Miss Hart tried to stand straighter in her sorrow. Leonard placed a hand on Slack's sleeve with the delicate temerity of a vicar, reminding a policeman that grief is also parish business. And in the shade of the chestnut, Miss Marple touched the cool side of Mr. Pritchard's abandoned cup, and thought of how tea is used as kindness or cover in equal measure. The afternoon tilted into that hour when shadows lengthen and nerves fray. Slack dismissed most with promises to call again. Before he sent Miss Marple off, he paused. If I find anything in the doctor's report, I'll be back. You would be back in any case, Miss Marple said. It is your habit. Slack's mouth almost smiled. And yours is to know more than you say. Knowledge is sometimes chiefly a matter of waiting, Miss Marple said. When people are troubled, they talk to those who seem to be listening without judgment. Old ladies are very useful in that way. She rose, a careful, small motion, and as she did a petal loosened from the roses, drifted, and landed like a little pink comma on the saucer of the full cup by the trellis. Miss Marple's eyes followed it. Then she turned to go. On the path, she met Dr. Haydock again. The stern look softened into reluctant curiosity. You think something's off, Miss Marple? I think, she said, that the teacup that refilled itself will tell us who cannot abide the taste of consequences. That has always been the trouble with sweet things, Doctor. They hide a multitude of intentions. The next morning found Saint Mary Mead in that peculiar state where routine continues, but with the air of a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. Curtains twitched more often than usual. The milkman, arriving at the corner shop, received twice as many questions as orders, and in the high street, Mrs. Price Ridley and Mr. Footit held a conversation so low and intense by the greengrocers that one could almost hear the silence between their words. The vicarage garden, the scene of yesterday's tea, now held only the traces of upended chairs and a faint print of a shoe in the soft edge of the gravel path, already blurred by the night's dew. Miss Marple had been in her front garden since 8, ostensibly tying up her sweet peas, but in reality, listening to the currents of village talk that carried on the morning air. It was not long before young Constable Reed came up the lane, trying very hard to look as though he were on official business, rather than delivering gossip under the guise of a respectful nod to an elderly lady. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said, pausing just at her gate. "Inspector Slack's been to the doctor's already. They're saying it was the heart. Dr. Haydock found nothing. Well, nothing you could put a charge to. But the inspector, he's not satisfied." "Very proper of him," Miss Marple said, adjusting the twine around a stem. "A heart may fail on its own, but it may also be persuaded to do so." Reed shifted on his feet, glancing down the lane to be sure no one else heard. "Between you and me, there's talk about that tea. The inspector asked me to fetch the pot and cups. Mrs. Bantry had washed them by then, of course, but the one from by Mr. Pritchard, well, Mrs. Bantry said it looked the same as any other. Can't prove what's gone down the sink." "That's the trouble with liquids, Constable," Miss Marple said. "They leave only the faintest traces, and those not always in the cup." She snipped a dead blossom and let it fall. "It's in the hands that poured them that the truth rests." Reed looked as though he wanted to ask more, but the habit of deference to one's elders in St. Mary Mead, especially to Miss Marple, made him tip his helmet instead. "I'd best be on. Slack's calling in Denning and Mrs. Ellison this morning." After he had gone, Miss Marple stood very still, her fingers resting lightly on the gate latch. Mrs. Ellison's name brought back the faint flush and tightness around the woman's mouth the previous day, the little pause before she spoke about the money order. People in villages could forgive theft more easily than embarrassment. That was one of the unkind truths of small places. And then there was Denning, his attention toward Clara just enough to notice, just enough to draw the whispering kind of notice that could sour a reputation. By mid-morning, Miss Marple took her knitting down toward the high street, claiming she needed a packet of needles from the draper's. The walk allowed her to pass the hall and note that the great iron gate stood ajar, as if the place itself had grown careless. Clara Godfrey emerged just then, a scarf knotted at her throat despite the warm day, and started when she saw Miss Marple. "Oh, good morning," she said, with that polite brightness of someone who has been crying and doesn't wish it remarked upon. "Good morning, my dear. You've been to the hall, I see. How is Lady Averil?" Clara hesitated. "She's tired. Yesterday unsettled her. She and Mr. Pritchard had words last week, and she's convinced people will make something of it. I told her no one would, but, well, you know how people are." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice. They are most inventive when left with gaps to fill. Perhaps she might be wise to close those gaps herself before others do it for her. Clara bit her lip. It was about the sale, of course. He thought the London party unsuitable. Said they'd change the character of the place. Lady Averil thinks so too, but she hasn't many choices. She gave a small, helpless shrug. "Mr. Denning says the consortium's offer is fairer, but they have all sorts of conditions. She can't face more disruption." Miss Marple gave a mild, "Ah," and let the girl go, watching her cross the street toward the post office. Clara's steps were quick, but her head was bent, and she did not notice Mrs. Ellison emerging from the shop next door. The two nearly collided, exchanged brief words, too brief for real civility, and went their separate ways. It was the kind of encounter that might mean nothing, or quite a lot. At the draper's, Miss Marple bought her needles and lingered, ostensibly over buttons, while Mrs. Bantry came in, her voice lowered to an urgent pitch. "Have you heard? Slack says the coroner's report will take days, but he's not letting go. He's been to see the postmistress again about that order, and, listen to this, Mr. Pritchard's account book is missing from his desk." "That is vexing," Miss Marple murmured. "One would think a man as careful as Mr. Pritchard would keep it locked away." "That's just it. He always did," Mrs. Bantry said. "Griselda told me the Reverend went round this morning to fetch some papers for the choir fund, and the lock on the drawer was forced. Now why would anyone force a lock after the man's dead?" "Why indeed?" Miss Marple said, her eyes settling for a moment on the small mirror above the buttons, which reflected the door closing behind Mrs. Ellison. The woman's expression was composed, but her hand lingered at the clasp of her bag, as if making sure something was safely inside. When Miss Marple returned home, she found Leonard Clement himself walking up her path. He looked troubled in the way vicars do when worldly matters press on them. "Miss Marple, forgive the intrusion, but I wondered, did you notice anything yesterday that might help? I've been with Inspector Slack. He's convinced there's more to this than heart trouble, but he says people are holding back. I do hate the thought of secrets festering in the parish." Miss Marple motioned him to a chair in her small sitting room and poured tea. "My dear Leonard, secrets are like damp. They creep in whether one likes it or not. The best one can do is see where the plaster bulges." He managed a smile. "That's a very particular answer." "It is a particular matter," she replied. "Someone poured that second cup for Mr. Pritchard. Someone who wished him to drink it where he stood, not at the table. And I should think it was someone he would not refuse." The vicar considered. "That narrows it to perhaps half a dozen." "Indeed. And one mustn't forget that human beings often act for reasons entirely separate from the result. A person might wish to spare a friend embarrassment, or to hide an unkindness, and find they have done something far graver." Before he could press her further, a knock came at the door. It was young Reed again, breathless. "Inspector Slack says, would you mind coming by the station, Miss Marple? Mrs. Ellison's been making a statement and, well, he says you might be able to tell if she's leaving something out." Miss Marple took up her gloves with the quiet air of one going to a church service. At the station, she found Mrs. Ellison seated very straight, her bag clasped in her lap. Slack was leaning back in his chair, his expression one of polite skepticism. "I've told you, Inspector," Mrs. Ellison was saying. "I spoke to Mr. Pritchard only to ask after the choir fund. He was perfectly well then. I did not take him tea, and I have nothing whatever to do with his death." Slack glanced at Miss Marple. "Would you mind sitting in? Sometimes folks speak freer with a friendly face present." Mrs. Ellison's mouth tightened, but she did not object. Miss Marple settled herself, knitting in hand, and asked mildly, "And your nephew, my dear? Has he found a position yet?" The question landed, as Miss Marple intended, not as an accusation, but as a domestic inquiry. Mrs. Ellison's gaze flickered. "Not yet. It's most unjust. He's a clever boy. That business with the money order was a misunderstanding, and I won't have it held against him." "Of course not," Miss Marple said. "Misunderstandings do occur. I remember during the war, a young man took it upon himself to, well, never mind. Only I do recall that his aunt was most anxious no one should think ill of him, and went to quite extraordinary lengths to keep his name clear." Mrs. Ellison shifted in her chair. "I am not in the habit of extraordinary lengths." "No," Miss Marple agreed, her tone almost absent. "Merely ordinary kindnesses, like taking someone a fresh cup of tea if you thought the one he had was unpleasant." There was the smallest pause. Mrs. Ellison looked at her directly then, as if weighing the cost of denial. But she only said, "I told you I did not take him tea," and rose, declaring she had an appointment. When she was gone, Slack exhaled. "She's holding something back, I'll swear to it." Miss Marple wound her yarn. "Oh yes, Inspector, but the thing she's holding may not be the thing you think. The trick is to find who, besides Mrs. Ellison, might have wanted that cup poured, and why the account book is missing. In my experience, those two matters will prove to be the same. Slack looked at her sharply. And you already have someone in mind? Not yet, Miss Marple said, which was not quite true. But people will talk, Inspector. They always do, especially when they think you are not listening for what they mean, only for what they say. She rose then, knowing that by evening someone would have said just a little too much over a pot of tea, and the edges of the picture would begin to show. The following day dawned with that deceptive brightness peculiar to early summer in St. Mary Mead, when the air feels as though it means to be kind, but holds a faint, restless undertone. Miss Marple, having taken her breakfast by the open window, noticed that the postman lingered longer than usual at certain gates, his satchel lighter than the conversations he left behind. News was moving, not official news. Inspector Slack was too guarded for that. But the sort of half-shaped reports that travel by way of grocery counters and garden fences. By mid-morning, she had her hat on and was making her way toward the vicarage under the pretense of returning a borrowed book. Along the lane, she encountered Mrs. Bantry, who was clearly in a mood to confide. "Jane, I've just come from Griselda. You'll never guess. Slack's found that account book. In the hall of all places. In the library, tucked behind a row of gardening books. Lady Averil swears she's never seen it before." Miss Marple's eyes softened. "The hall, you say? That is interesting." "More than interesting," Mrs. Bantry said with relish. "It's made Slack even more convinced this wasn't just the heart. What on earth would Mr. Pritchard's accounts be doing there? Unless he meant to show them to someone at the tea, and was prevented." Miss Marple merely inclined her head. "And the book itself? Was anything missing?" "That's the curious part. According to Slack, there's a page neatly torn out. Not a scribble or blot anywhere else. Just that gap." "Oh, I do love a proper mystery, Jane. Though I must say I liked Mr. Pritchard. He was solid." Solid, Miss Marple thought, was often the word used for men whose habits were as dependable as the clock on the church tower, and whose absence was felt in much the same way when they stopped. She parted from Mrs. Bantry at the vicarage gate and found Griselda in the drawing-room, arranging flowers with the distracted air of someone whose thoughts were elsewhere. "I hear the account book's been found," Miss Marple began. Griselda nodded, slipping a stem into place. "Yes, and Leonard's quite upset. It makes the whole thing seem worse somehow. Slack's been asking everyone if they saw Mr. Pritchard with it yesterday. I told him I didn't, but Leonard thinks he may have had it in his bag when he came to the tea. Oh, and Clara Godfrey was here earlier. She's dreadfully anxious about the sale of the hall now. She says the London party have increased their offer, and Denning's urging Lady Averil to take it quickly before rumours unsettle them. I asked what rumours, but she just bit her lip and said she didn't want to talk in front of the maid." That, to Miss Marple's mind, was as good as saying the rumours were worth hearing. She sat a while with Griselda, talking of nothing in particular, before making her way back toward the High Street. She paused at the post office, where Miss Hart was behind the counter, her usual shyness subdued by a clear eagerness to share what she knew. "Inspector Slack's been in again, Miss Marple," she whispered. "He wanted to see the signature on that money order. I told him the boy's hand was, well, artistic, like I said, but he also asked if Mr. Pritchard had posted anything lately. I said yes, a registered envelope the day before the tea, addressed to some firm in London. I had to look it up for him. Taverner and Blythe. Solicitors they are. Quite grand, judging by the paper." Miss Marple thanked her and stepped out, tucking the name away. Solicitors in London could mean many things, but paired with an account book and a torn page, it suggested a matter Mr. Pritchard had wanted formalised. Perhaps something to do with the hall, perhaps something more personal. At the corner, she encountered Clara herself, looking pale and flustered. "Miss Marple, I've just come from Lady Averil's. Mr. Denning was there with papers for her to sign. She wouldn't, of course. She's too upset. But he kept saying it was only a matter of form, that it would secure the sale. I think she's afraid of being hurried into something. Miss Marple studied the girl's face. And are you? Clara hesitated. I don't know. Mr. Denning says it's the best offer we'll get. But Lady Averil was very fond of Mr. Pritchard, for all their arguments. She said she trusted his judgment about people. If he thought the London party unsuitable, she feels she ought to think twice. She twisted her gloves. And now, with what's happened? There was no need to finish the thought. In villages, events like Mr. Pritchard's sudden death clung to everything they touched. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on Clara's arm. Sometimes, my dear, when we do not know what to think, the wisest course is to do nothing, at least until we can see the whole picture. They parted, and Miss Marple continued toward the hall. The great house looked no less imposing for its peeling paint and overgrown drive. She found Lady Averil in the library, surrounded by stacks of correspondence. She was a tall, spare woman, with the kind of presence that suggested she had been beautiful in a way that had more to do with confidence than features. Miss Marple, she said, rising, I'm sure you've heard the latest. The police have been here, poking about as though the hall were a thieves' kitchen. And now Mr. Denning says I must decide on the sale immediately, or risk losing both offers. It's all too much. Miss Marple listened with sympathy, her gaze moving to the shelf where the account book had been found. I understand they discovered Mr. Pritchard's accounts here, behind the gardening section. Yes, though how they came there, I cannot say. I hardly ever touch those books. My late husband was the gardener in spirit, if not in fact. Inspector Slack asked if Mr. Pritchard had visited recently. He hadn't, not for weeks. But Clara told me she saw him near the hall the day before the tea. Speaking to one of the under gardeners, I thought nothing of it at the time. That is worth recalling, Miss Marple said mildly. And the torn page. Did you notice any disturbance in the shelves? Lady Averil shook her head. No, but I do recall Mr. Denning being in here alone yesterday morning before I came down. He said he was looking for the plans of the West Wing to show the London buyers. She gave a weary sigh. I suppose I must believe it. Still, the timing feels unpleasant. Miss Marple agreed it was unfortunate. She did not linger long enough to see the faintly smug look on Denning's face as she passed him in the hall, and to note that his hand went instinctively to his breast pocket when he saw her, as though making sure something was still there. On her way home, she encountered Inspector Slack himself, striding along with the energy of a man whose suspicions had been sharpened rather than dulled. Afternoon, Miss Marple. You've heard about the account book? Yes, and I dare say it complicates matters. That's one way of putting it. The missing page, well, I'll wager it held something someone didn't want seen. My guess is it was torn out before Pritchard came to the tea. But whether that happened here or somewhere else... He trailed off, eyeing her. You've been talking to Lady Averil, I suppose. She was good enough to receive me, Miss Marple said. I understand Mr. Denning had access to the library yesterday morning. Slack made a note of it. Between you and me, I'm starting to think this is all about the hall. Land, money, old quarrels. They make a stronger poison than any you'd put in a teacup. Miss Marple gave him a small, knowing smile. Sometimes, Inspector, the quarrels are old, but the motive is quite fresh, like a cup that's been topped up to hide what it contained before. Slack looked at her sharply, then nodded. You think the two, account book and tea, are linked? I think, Miss Marple said, that someone feared Mr. Pritchard might say something, perhaps yesterday, perhaps in days to come, that would make their position untenable. Removing a page is one way of hiding a fact. Removing the man is another. As she walked the rest of the way home, she considered the threads drawing together. Mrs. Ellison's flinch at the mention of her nephew, Denning's eagerness to secure the sale, Clara's unease, Lady Averil's reliance on Mr. Pritchard's judgment, and the mysterious London solicitors. She suspected that before long, someone would make the mistake of thinking her interest was purely conversational, and when they did, she would be ready to listen, not to what they said, but to what they could not quite keep from revealing. By late afternoon, the village had settled into that uneasy imitation of normality people adopt when they have decided, without admitting it, to wait for someone else to act. Miss Marple had spent the noon hour in her little back garden among the scarlet runner beans, considering the way some truths will not walk into a room unless you give them the right doorway. Tea is a very good doorway. People relax into their habits over tea, and habit, she had learned, was nothing more or less than character taking its ease. She sent 3 notes by the errand boy from the grocer's, small, stiff cards written in her neat hand. Mrs. Ellison received an invitation to a few quiet cups at 4:30. Mr. Denning was asked to bring any news from the hall to enlighten an old woman. Clara Godfrey's card added, Lady Avril will be comforted if we all keep our heads. None of the invitations named the others. In a village, that was unnecessary. Griselda would bring herself as a matter of course. One did not permit an old friend to host tea alone when the parish was in crisis. And somewhere between the vicarage and the green, news would drift to Inspector Slack that Miss Marple was pouring. Experience suggested he would arrive under the pretense of returning a book. Before the clock in the hall chimed the quarter, Miss Marple put on water and laid out 2 plates of seed cake, the last of Mrs. Bantry's, saved for the purpose, and a pot of strawberry jam. She placed her own teapot, and beside it, a second, slightly heavier pot lent by Griselda. The difference in weight would be useful. She also fetched from a drawer a tray with a raised edge. It made a very tidy show of kindness, and had the incidental advantage that a cup filled too generously would not baptize her rug. At past precisely, Mrs. Ellison appeared, tight at the mouth and bright at the eyes, in the way of a woman who has slept badly and decided not to show it. She carried a tiny bunch of sweet peas knotted with string. A poor offering, she said, placing them in Miss Marple's hand, as if paying a debt. They are lovely, Miss Marple said, meaning it. She set them in a narrow vase and returned to the table just as Clara came in, breathless, apology on her lips. I hate to be late, Clara said. Lady Avril napped. I couldn't leave her until she settled. You are not late at all, Miss Marple said, pouring into 3 cups with a domestic gravity that seemed to ease the room. She set 1 cup very full and slid it toward Clara with a murmur. Mind the brim, dear, and noted, without looking directly, how Mrs. Ellison's hand twitched as if to rescue it. Old hands do that. They cannot bear to watch spillage. Denning entered with the smile of a man who wishes to be thought unflappable. He had left his jacket unbuttoned and wore a carnation too large for his lapel. Miss Marple, he said, with a cheerfulness that rang a little, you tempt a poor agent with promises of enlightenment. I confess I come to be enlightened as well. Tea enlightens everyone if properly poured, Miss Marple said. Do sit down. Seed cake? Not for me, he replied, touching his breast pocket in that small protective way she had seen at the hall. Doctor's orders. Indigestion. Griselda arrived next, bringing a small jar of honey and an expression that said she knew quite well what Miss Marple was about and approved. She placed the honey between the jam and the teapot, as if setting down a mediator at a contentious parish meeting. Leonard sends regrets, she said, which meant Leonard would follow when he felt his absence could not be mistaken for indifference. In villages, even virtues had to be performed in the right order. They made the soft, necessary talk of an English tea, the weather's deceit, the roses going over, the astonishing price of eggs, until the first cups thinned to their last inch. Miss Marple laid the second pot nearer Clara and waited. Mrs. Ellison's hand, drawn like a needle to a magnet, reached. Let me refresh you, dear. It's stronger in this one. And without a pause tipped clear tea into the dregs, quick, neat, the wrist turning with a practiced economy that made the surface rise almost to the lip without a spill. Thank you, Clara said, startled by the speed more than the service. She lifted the cup obediently, sipped, and set it down with the small, guarded grimace of one who does not care for very strong tea. Most kind, Miss Marple murmured, attending, not to the faces, but to the little silences that followed. Denning's gaze slid to the heavier pot and away. He was not a refresher by habit. He preferred a fresh cup, she suspected, or a different beverage altogether. Griselda's eyes, after the faintest flicker, moved to Miss Marple's face with the ghost of a nod. Seen, noted, added to the pattern. "Inspector Slack," said Griselda as the knock came, "has a genius for timing." Slack came in with the clumsy humility of a big man in a small room. He pretended to look for a book he had left last week and accepted tea as if it were the penalty for intrusion. Miss Marple poured him from the first pot and, when his eye drifted to the second, she said, "That one is stronger, Inspector. For those who like a kick." "Not for me," Slack said too quickly, then added, with professional suspicion enlivening his face, "You're experimenting on us, Miss Marple." "Observing," she said. "One learns a great deal from the way people mind a brim." He grunted, half amused, half wary, and took seed cake. "News," he said to the room in general and to no one in particular. "The London solicitors, Taverner and Blythe, have acknowledged a registered packet from Mr. Pritchard, posted the day before the tea." Clara's head came up sharply. Denning's hand went to his pocket again, so quickly now it might have been a reflex. Mrs. Ellison's spoon rang once against her saucer. "What was in it?" Griselda asked, saving everyone from asking at once. "They do not say," Slack replied, relishing the effect his caution produced. "Client confidentiality and all that. But they are sending a man down to speak to me. That alone tells me it wasn't a subscription to a magazine. And we found something else at the hall. The gardener remembers Pritchard asking about a side door by the library earlier in the week. Said he wanted to see the old accounts in daylight." Funny phrase. "I don't find it funny," Denning said, too light. "The library is dim as a crypt. Anyone would seek daylight to read figures. The man had a mania for them. He tried to advise Lady Averil on chimney pots, if you please." Clara sat forward. "Mr. Pritchard meant well. He thought the hall was part of the village. He said once that if the right people held it, even bricks could be kind." "Bricks," Mrs. Ellison murmured with a shiver of disdain, "are never kind. They are only heavy. Weight can be used for shelter," Miss Marple said, and watched the curious way Mrs. Ellison's fingers tightened on her bag at the word used. "Tell me, my dear," she added gently, turning to Clara, "had Mr. Pritchard promised Lady Averil anything particular of late?" Clara hesitated. Then, as often happens when a question is asked in kindness rather than demand, truth slipped out. "He said he would make sure no one could hurry her. He said if she wanted time she should have it, and he would put it where even gentlemen with pens can't. Poke it." "I don't know what he meant." "A registered envelope to London," Slack said, in the dry way of a man laying cards on a table one by one. "A page torn from his account book, and a side door to a dim library. It's polishing itself into a story." "Stories do polish themselves, Inspector," Miss Marple said. "Like silver. You see your face in them if you rub long enough. The difficulty is to see whether the face is yours or someone else's." Denning laughed, a trifle loudly. "You'll have us all chasing our reflections, Miss Marple. Surely the sensible thing is to wait on the solicitor's man." "Sensible things are rarely done when people are afraid," Miss Marple said mildly. "Fear makes very hasty tea." At that, Mrs. Ellison set down her cup with a small, betraying clatter. "I am not afraid," she said, "only tired. I cannot bear to see good people maligned. My nephew—" "No one is maligning your nephew," Slack said, with an earnestness that would have been kinder if it had not sounded like a policeman setting a trap with velvet gloves. "A refused money order is not a rope around anyone's neck, but it does explain a person's wish that a man known for his correctness should not have cause to repeat his observations." Mrs. Ellison coloured. "You will make mischief of anything. Mr. Pritchard mentioned the matter to me at the tea. He did, I'll not deny it. He liked to needle. If I took him a fresh cup to be civil, what of it? Must every small courtesy become a charge?" Clara's eyes turned, startled. "You took him tea," Mrs. Ellison's face closed like a book snapped shut. "I will not be questioned like a thief. I am a woman of the parish." "Indeed you are," Miss Marple said, perfectly placid. "And women of the parish are generally the ones to keep tempers from boiling over. You have refreshed more cups at more fêtes than any of us." For a moment, the room sat in that delicate balance between accusation and absolution. Then Griselda, with the tact of a woman who has laid cutlery for many awkward dinners, reached for the honey. "Do try this, Clara. It's from Mrs. Pierce's hives. She swears her bees prefer marjoram." The conversation loosened itself into safer strands, and yet, like a net, they all drew tighter. Clara spoke of the hall's draughty corridors and Lady Averell's insistence on walking them each morning. Denning, with a touch of impatience, explained again the difference between the London party's ready cash and the consortium's conditions. A long tenancy for the West Wing, some odd clause about public access to the gardens, a museum piece or two to be held in trust. "No one wants tourists trampling the lawns," he said, and there it was, the little sneer that turns a practical point into a social division. Miss Marple reached without looking and straightened the spoon by Denning's saucer. "Public access can be a kind of kindness," she said, "if it is done with dignity. I knew a gentleman once who opened his orchard once a year so that children could pick windfalls. He said windfalls belong to everyone. He found, over time, his trees bore better fruit." "Sentimental nonsense," Denning said, but he flushed as he spoke, as men do when they discover they have taken the unfashionable side in a room they had counted on to approve them. Slack stood, brushing crumbs from his trousers, and thanked Miss Marple with gruff sincerity. At the door he paused, as if remembering something trivial that might not be trivial at all. One more point. The undergardener says that when Pritchard came by the side door 2 days ago, he had a brown envelope under his arm and a small notebook. He left with the envelope, but not, the lad thinks, with the notebook. He says he saw Mr. Denning later with a pocketbook that did not look his own. Lads notice odd things. Denning's laugh came too quickly. "The boy must have seen my valuation book. They are very common in my trade." "Common things," Miss Marple said, refilling her own cup at last, "are the ones that tell the truth when they are out of place. A common notebook in an uncommon pocket, for instance." Denning's eyes met hers and slipped away. Mrs. Ellison folded her hands over her bag, as if mending something inside by the pressure. Clara, looking from one to the other, seemed to understand for the first time that truths could pull against each other, like threads in a tapestry, tightening one figure while loosening another. After they had gone, Griselda stayed to help wash the cups, not because Miss Marple needed help, but because Griselda wished to say in privacy what she could not before. "Jane, Dolly will have the village in a fever by nightfall. Slack will be here at dawn with questions larger than his notebook. Are you any nearer?" Miss Marple dried a saucer, thinking of the jam's crescent mark on a cup, of the neat, unthinking wrist that refreshed without asking, of a man who could not bear a page out of place and sent one perhaps to London to be safe. "Nearer," she said, "but not near enough. One must always be careful, Griselda, not to mistake the person who hides a thing for the person who needs it hidden." "Then who needs it hidden?" "The one who would be most altered by the light," Miss Marple said. She set the saucer down, and with a small sigh that was almost contentment, added, "Tomorrow I shall ask to see the hall's library alone. There is a habit in that room too, I think, and habits, bless them, are untidy when they are frightened." Outside, the first coolness of evening slid along the hedges. Somewhere far up the lane, a child called for a lost ball, and a mother answered. Miss Marple stood a moment at the doorway with her drying cloth in her hands, listening to the village settle itself for the night. It had decided, as she knew it would, to let the old lady listen a little longer. In that decision lay all the permission she needed for the next small, decisive step. The next morning was bright, but with a sharpness in the air that suggested change, as if the weather itself were turning its thoughts toward other matters. Miss Marple had written a note to Lady Averil, requesting the small favour of an hour in the hall's library to satisfy an old curiosity about country house shelving. She sent it by the errand boy before breakfast, knowing that politeness in a village often works faster than urgency in a city. By 10:30, a reply had arrived in Lady Averil's firm, elegant hand, granting her the liberty of the library at any hour. Though I fear you will find the books dull, unless gardening treatises are your passion. Miss Marple smiled at the choice of words. Dull books had a way of being the best hiding places. She walked up to the hall, taking the long path past the orchard, where she noticed a small ladder lying under a pear tree, its rungs smeared with fresh paint. An unremarkable sight to most, but she filed it away. Ladders rarely lie about without reason, and fresh paint in old gardens is often a sign of hasty repair. Lady Averil received her briefly in the morning room, wrapped in a shawl, though the fire burned low. "The library is at your disposal, Miss Marple. Clara is in the garden, if you should wish for company. Mr. Denning is elsewhere, which is something of a relief." The library was dim and cool, the scent of old bindings and beeswax giving it the air of a place where secrets could be kept indefinitely. The tall shelves were crowded with books in no strict order. The section nearest the window held the gardening volumes, where the account book had been found. She stood there a moment, imagining Mr. Pritchard reaching for them, the brown envelope under his arm, the missing page somewhere between his fingers, and the post office. It took only a little patience to find a faint outline in the dust on the shelf, where something slimmer than the neighbouring volumes had sat for some time and was recently removed. She knelt, running her finger along the back edge, and found a small scrap of paper fallen into the gap between shelf and wall. It was torn from a ledger, the ink blurred where it had absorbed a drop of moisture, but the figures were still clear. A sum of £450, written beside the words, "Repair Fund, West Wing." The date was recent, only a week old. She replaced it carefully and continued along the shelves, her fingers resting lightly on the spines. Near the far end, she found a small stack of pamphlets about historical trusts and public heritage schemes, one of which bore a penciled note in a cramped, tidy hand. "Discuss with T&B, secure before sale." Taverner and Blythe, no doubt. She imagined Mr. Pritchard's deliberate way of folding such a pamphlet into his envelope, sealing it as if it were a promise. A faint sound made. Her turn. Clara stood in the doorway, a little breathless from the garden. "Lady Averil said you were here. I thought perhaps you'd like company." "Always," Miss Marple said. "Tell me, my dear, did Mr. Pritchard ever mention the repair fund to you?" Clara frowned. "Once. He said there was money put aside for the West Wing repairs, enough to make the place safe without selling in haste. But he was worried about how it might be reallocated, as he called it. He didn't trust certain people to keep it where it belonged." She coloured slightly. "I suppose he meant Mr. Denning, though he never said so outright." "That would explain much," Miss Marple said. "If the fund existed, it would give Lady Averil time, which might not suit those eager for a quick sale." Clara's eyes widened. "Do you think someone could have taken it?" "In villages and in houses," Miss Marple said, "money often walks away on legs that swear they are doing something perfectly proper. The difficulty is in proving where it walked from." They were interrupted by the sound of brisk footsteps. Denning entered without knocking, a file under his arm. "Ah, Miss Marple, I hear you've taken an interest in our dusty shelves. You won't find much of value, at least, not to you." "I find many things of value," Miss Marple said mildly. "For instance, it is always useful to know where a book is not, especially when it was once there." He looked at her for a moment, perhaps weighing the cost of a careless reply, then smiled. "I suppose the inspector has been filling your head with theories. I prefer facts." "Facts," Miss Marple said, "are like teacups. They must be filled before they can be of use. Sometimes it's very telling to see who insists on pouring." Denning's smile thinned. "If you'll excuse me, I have business with Lady Averill." After he left, Clara exhaled as though she had been holding her breath. "He makes me nervous," she said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "And nervous people sometimes hurry their hands." She spent another half-hour in the library, noting how certain sections were dustier than others, how the small desk near the hearth had a faint ring where a teacup had once sat, odd in a room seldom used for tea. She left the hall satisfied she had enough to think on and walked back to the village. Near the green, she encountered Mrs. Ellison, whose expression brightened at the sight of her, as though she had been waiting for just this meeting. "Miss Marple, I have been thinking about yesterday. I may have neglected to say something. When I took that cup to Mr. Pritchard, I meant only to be civil. But he was not alone. Mr. Denning was with him, by the trellis. They stopped talking when I came up. I thought it was nothing at the time. Men don't like their conversations overheard by women. But perhaps, Miss Marple said softly, it was something after all. And did you notice his manner? Mr. Pritchard's." Mrs. Ellison frowned, as though replaying it. "He looked resolute, as if he had made up his mind about something unpleasant. He thanked me for the tea, but he didn't drink from it while I was there. That I do remember. And when you left, I was scarcely gone a minute before I heard the cup set down. He had that habit, you know, of putting it down firmly. Then, well, I suppose it must have been then that—" She trailed off, pressing her lips together. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on her arm. "You've been most helpful, my dear. Sometimes, you see, it's the small sound that tells you the most." That evening, Inspector Slack came to call, his notebook tucked under his arm. "The man from Taverner and Blythe's been," he said. "Pritchard sent them documents about the repair fund, proof that it existed, with bank records to back it. He instructed them to hold it in trust for Lady Averill, to be used only for the West Wing. If those papers had been shown before the sale, well, it would have pulled the rug out from under anyone arguing for a quick deal." "And the missing page from the account book," Miss Marple asked, "would have matched the bank records. Neatly torn out, gone missing, and the fund made to look like it never existed. If we can prove who took it—" He broke off, eyeing her shrewdly. "You've already got an idea, haven't you?" "I have a suspicion," Miss Marple said, "and a habit of waiting until the right person tries to fill the wrong cup." Slack smiled, not without respect. "Then we'll see what happens when we start pouring." After he left, Miss Marple sat by her window in the fading light, knitting in her lap. In her mind's eye she saw the trellis, the too full cup, the deliberate topping up that could disguise the taste of what lay beneath. She saw the faint outline in the dust where a ledger had rested, the penciled note about Taverner and Blythe, the figure in the torn scrap, £450. And she knew that someone in the village was still hoping no one would notice the taste beneath the sweetness. The next step, she thought, was to make sure they tasted it again, only this time in front of everyone. The following morning dawned with a clarity that seemed almost deliberate, the kind of sunlight that lays bare the seams in curtains and the scuff marks on hall floors. Miss Marple had been awake since dawn, moving quietly through her little house, setting the tea to draw and laying out her knitting, though she had no intention of spending the day in stillness. She had decided, as she fastened her brooch before the mirror, that the moment had come to bring her threads together in public. The right setting would be one where the village could gather without suspicion, where conversation would flow easily, and where those who had something to hide would be tempted to speak too much or too little. She found her opportunity when Griselda arrived mid-morning with a suggestion that might have been her own thought reflected back. "Leonard says we ought to hold a small gathering at the vicarage this afternoon. Nothing formal, just a few neighbours. He thinks it will keep people from spinning themselves into knots over rumours." "A very good idea," Miss Marple said, and her eyes brightened almost imperceptibly. "It is in moments like these that a little gentle company can be most clarifying." By 3 o'clock the vicarage garden was set with tables, not as precisely as for the church tea, but with enough ceremony to make it feel deliberate. Seed cake again, a plate of cucumber sandwiches, 2 pots of tea, 1 lighter, 1 stronger, and a jug of lemonade for appearance's sake. Leonard moved among the guests with the distracted goodwill of a man whose parish was both his pride and his burden, while Griselda kept the talk from straying into too dark channels. Mrs. Ellison arrived first, wearing a hat with a brim large enough to serve as a shield. She offered to pour, but was gently steered to a seat by Griselda, leaving the pots on the table where Miss Marple, with an air of mild helpfulness, could reach them. Clara came next with Lady Averil, the latter looking pale but composed, her shawl drawn closely about her shoulders despite the warmth. Denning arrived last, bringing with him the faint scent of expensive cologne and the smooth assurance of a man who believes the tide is turning his way. Miss Marple poured carefully, keeping track of which pot each guest received from. The stronger brew she reserved for Mrs. Ellison and Denning, watching the small changes in their expressions as they tasted. There was no poison in these cups, of course, merely an invitation to memory. The conversation began with polite talk of the roses, the schoolchildren's upcoming play, and a sighting of a fox in the orchard. Miss Marple listened, adding only the smallest comments, until Leonard, prompted perhaps by her quiet glance, turned the talk. "It's such a pity about poor Mr. Pritchard," he said gravely. "Inspector Slack tells me the solicitor has confirmed there was indeed a repair fund for the West Wing. It seems he meant to ensure Lady Averil had time to make the right decision for the hall." The words hung for a moment in the warm air. Denning shifted slightly in his seat. Mrs. Ellison's spoon clinked against her saucer. Lady Averil spoke first, her voice low but steady. "If that is so, then his death is an even greater loss. I trusted his judgment, even when we disagreed. Odd, then," Miss Marple said gently, "that the very page showing that fund should have been torn from his account book and the book itself hidden here, in your library, Lady Averil, and that the page was missing before the book was found." Clara's eyes widened, Denning's narrowed. "Are you suggesting," he said, with a laugh that was meant to sound dismissive, "that someone here removed it? That would be absurd." "Absurdities," Miss Marple replied mildly, "are sometimes just facts in disguise. Consider, the page vanishes, the fund appears to be gone, the urgency to sell increases. And then, quite suddenly, Mr. Pritchard is found dead, with a fresh cup of tea poured for him where he stood, not where he sat." Mrs. Ellison's voice came sharp. "You make it sound as though that was some kind of scheme." "I told you, I only meant to be polite." "Indeed you did," Miss Marple said, "and your politeness was well timed. For if Mr. Pritchard had sat back down at the table, he might have spoken of what he had sent to London, proof of the fund and the safeguards for Lady Averil, proof that would have made any attempt to rush the sale rather pointless." Slack, who had arrived quietly at the edge of the gathering, stepped forward. "And if he had spoken of it, Miss Marple?" "Then," she said, "those who had argued there was no money to repair the hall would have been shown in a very different light. The London buyers might have hesitated. The consortium's offer might have seemed preferable, and someone who had perhaps already adjusted certain sums would have been in difficulty." Denning's composure faltered. "You cannot possibly mean—" "I mean only," Miss Marple said, "that the missing page, the hidden account book, and the convenient death of the man who knew the truth form a pattern. And patterns, Mr. Denning, are what I notice best. You had access to the library, you had reason to prefer a quick sale, and you were seen with a notebook that was not yours. But you did not pour the tea." Her eyes turned to Mrs. Ellison, whose face had grown pale. "That was you, my dear. You did it without thinking of harm, merely to occupy him a moment, perhaps even to distract him, while Mr. Denning secured what he wanted. But in doing so, you gave him a cup already tainted with something that worked quickly and quietly, especially on a heart not as strong as it once was. You did not know, of course. That is why you looked so startled when I mentioned the cup." Mrs. Ellison's hand trembled on her lap. I I thought he looked troubled, and I didn't want anyone to overhear whatever he was about to say to Mr. Denning. I thought a fresh cup would… Well… She glanced at Denning, whose expression had turned to stone. Slack's voice was quiet but firm. And you, Mr. Denning? Denning's mouth twisted. If the page had come to light, Lady Averil might have delayed the sale indefinitely. The London party would have walked away. I was trying to secure her future. That fund wouldn't have covered the full repairs. She would have had to come back to me eventually. At your price, Miss Marple said, and with you holding the terms. There was a silence, broken only by the distant call of a bird. Lady Averil's gaze was level, her voice cold. You will leave the hall at once, Mr. Denning, and you will not return. Slack closed his notebook with a decisive snap. We'll take this up at the station. Mrs. Ellison, you'll need to give a statement. If what Miss Marple says is right, you've got no more than poor judgment to answer for. But Mr. Denning… He let the words hang, the meaning plain. As the inspector led them away, Miss Marple poured herself another cup, her hands steady. Griselda looked at her with open admiration. You were waiting for them to hang themselves, weren't you? Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, not hang themselves, my dear. Merely pour one cup too many. In villages, people are always pouring. Tea, gossip, assurances. And every now and then, they pour the truth without meaning to. She sipped, the taste of the brew entirely ordinary and perfectly safe, and watched the garden return to its gentle hum. The danger was gone, the funds safe, and Lady Averil's time restored. But she knew the village would keep speaking of the teacup that refilled itself, long after the roses had faded and the matter was officially closed. And in that speaking, the memory of what had nearly been lost would remain, quiet, like her own watchfulness, but enduring all the same. The sun was lowering toward the far hedge when the last of the vicarage guests had gone. The lawn, still warm from the afternoon, was scattered with crumbs and the faint ring marks of cups that had been set down a little too firmly. Leonard had retreated to his study with the air of a man who needed to turn the events over in his mind before speaking of them again. Griselda moved quietly between garden and kitchen, tidying in a way that suggested she was letting her thoughts settle as well. Miss Marple, however, remained in her chair under the shade of the laburnum, her knitting idle in her lap. She had learned over many years that when a matter was thought to be concluded, that was precisely when certain truths, unguarded at last, would drift into the open. She was not kept waiting long. Lady Averil reappeared at the edge of the lawn, Clara beside her. They had declined Leonard's offer of the side gate, choosing instead to walk past Miss Marple. Lady Averil paused, her face still pale, but her voice composed. Miss Marple, I owe you more than thanks. Without you, I might have signed away the hall on the strength of half a truth. It will take time to put things right, but at least I have the time. It is time well worth having, Miss Marple said. You will find, I think, that the West Wing will mend under patient hands, much like a garden after a storm. Clara gave a small, grateful smile, but there was a hesitation in her manner, as though something unsaid lingered on her tongue. There's one thing I've been meaning to tell you, she began. When Mr. Pritchard came to see Lady Averil last week, before all this happened, I overheard him speaking to the under-gardener. He asked about a ladder, whether it could be left near the side wall for a day or two. The gardener thought it odd, but Mr. Pritchard said it was for looking at the roof tiles. Miss Marple's eyes brightened, though her tone remained mild. That is useful to know. Roofs, like ledgers, can reveal more than some people wish. I noticed a ladder myself when I came up yesterday. Fresh paint on one of the rungs. Lady Averil looked faintly puzzled. What could a ladder have to do with any of this? Perhaps nothing, Miss Marple said. Perhaps everything. A ladder can be a way up, or a way in, and if one wanted to reach the library without being seen at the main door. She let the thought trail away, the implication left to them. They took their leave, and Miss Marple rose at last, gathering her knitting and stepping inside. She found Griselda at the sink, sleeves rolled up. "Leonard's gone to see Slack," Griselda said. "He couldn't sit still with it all hanging in the air. I think he half fears there's more to come." "There usually is," Miss Marple said, "especially when one piece of the pattern hasn't been fitted yet." She rinsed her cup, her mind on the image of the ladder, the torn page, and Denning's protective hand over his breast pocket. It was nearing dusk when Inspector Slack himself arrived, the dust of the lane still clinging to his shoes. He came without ceremony into the kitchen, accepted a cup of tea from Griselda, and leaned against the counter. "Denning's not saying a word," he reported. "Ellison's statement matches what you said. She poured the tea, but swears she didn't know what was in it. Forensics, what little we've got, says it was digitalis. Nasty in a heart already strained. The trouble is, it could have been in the cup before she poured. Could have been Denning. Could have been anyone who got to that pot before the tea was served." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "And the ladder?" Slack raised an eyebrow. "So you noticed it too?" "Gardner says it was there 2 days before Pritchard died. Marks on the side wall suggest someone climbed to the library window. The catch on that window's loose. You could push it open from outside. Wouldn't be hard to slip in, take a page from a book, slip out again." "Which would explain," Miss Marple said, "how the account book ended up behind the gardening section, hidden by someone who didn't want to be seen carrying it in through the main hall. A very cautious thief." Slack nodded. "Too cautious for his own good, maybe. The gardener says he saw a man's figure there at twilight that day. Couldn't swear to who, but the build was like Denning's. Still, a build's not evidence." "Builds can be borrowed," Miss Marple said. "A coat too large, a hat pulled low. The question is, who knew the page existed and had reason to remove it before Pritchard posted his packet? Denning, certainly. But there may be someone else whose name we haven't said enough." Slack frowned. "You think there's another hand in this?" "I think," Miss Marple said softly, "that Denning was not the only one eager to profit from a quick sale, and that someone else may have had a different reason entirely for wanting Pritchard silent." Slack's gaze sharpened, but before he could ask, a knock came at the back door. It was Miss Hart from the post office, cheeks flushed from the walk. "I'm sorry to trouble you, Miss Marple, but I thought you ought to know. Yesterday a letter came for Mr. Pritchard, redirected from London. I didn't think anything of it until I saw the return address, Taverner and Blythe. I've given it to the inspector, of course, but, well, it seemed important." Slack tore the envelope open. Inside was a brief letter, formal and precise, confirming receipt of Mr. Pritchard's instructions and enclosing a duplicate copy for your records. The copy was of a trust agreement, naming Lady Averil as beneficiary, with the sum of £450 ring-fenced for repairs to the West Wing, and at the bottom, a note in Pritchard's hand. "In case anything should happen to me, this will show the truth." Slack looked at Miss Marple over the top of the page. He knew. "Yes," she said. "And so did whoever feared that truth." She set her cup down and folded her hands. "Inspector, I believe it is time to ask Lady Averil to open her visitor's book for the past month. I suspect we shall find a name that has slipped quite neatly from everyone's mind, but not from the hall's doorstep." Slack gave her a long look, then nodded. "I'll send a man up there now." When he had gone, Griselda came to stand beside Miss Marple. "You think there's someone else entirely?" "Not entirely," Miss Marple said. "But crimes, like gardens, often have more than one root. Pull up one, and you may find another tangled alongside it. And if you don't dig far enough, the first frost will bring it back." Outside, the evening light had turned the lane to gold. Miss Marple sat very still, listening to the faint hum of the village beyond her window. Somewhere, she felt sure, the last and smallest piece of the pattern was waiting, hidden not in a ledger or a letter, but in the ordinary habit of someone who thought themselves unseen. And when it showed itself, as such things always did, she would be there to notice. Inspector Slack returned sooner than Miss Marple expected, the set of his shoulders telling her before he spoke that his errand had borne fruit of some kind. He stood just inside the kitchen door, the visitor's book in one hand, his thumb marking a place near the end, as if he feared the page might slip out and carry the truth with it. "You were right to ask," he said. "Lady Averill keeps a tidy register, God bless the old ways. Not many sign in these days unless they mean to be seen doing so, but there's a name here that doesn't sit as quiet as it thinks." He laid the book on the scrubbed table and turned it toward her. A neat procession of hands, Lady Averill's dressmaker, a piano tuner, Mr. Denning's long, impatient swirl, and 2 days before the church tea, a cramped, careful signature that tried for elegance and missed L. Ellison. Griselda drew a small breath. Her nephew. Slack nodded. "Says he called to discuss a temporary engagement." Odd way to put it. The undergardener remembers a stranger in a light coat at twilight that same day by the side wall, with a ladder lying near. Fresh paint on one rung, as you noted. The lad says the man kept his hat down and his collar up, weather be hanged. People think disguises are coats and spectacles. More often it's only posture and a brim. Miss Marple touched the ink with a fingertip, not to smudge but to feel its settledness. The hand had made little hesitations, then pressed too hard, pride and fear in the nib. "Mrs. Ellison said the boy's handwriting is artistic," she murmured. "People often call elaborate what is merely uncertain." Slack shut the book with a decisive care. "We'll have words with the young man." "Not yet," Miss Marple said, with that gentle firmness that in St. Mary Mead was as good as a bar across a doorway. "He will come if the ground is certain under him. At present it is not. His aunt will try to make it so." They went to Mrs. Ellison's cottage together, taking the path past the allotments, where foxgloves stood in scandalous pink spires above the onions. A bee blundered from one bell and drifted away heavy with intention. Miss Marple paused a moment, as if admiring the bed, and only then walked on. Mrs. Ellison opened at once, as those do who have been waiting on the knock. Her eyes moved from Slack to Miss Marple, and a defensive dignity rose like starch. "If this is about my statement, it is about your nephew, my dear," Miss Marple said. "We thought perhaps you could tell him he's wanted at the vicarage for a small matter. If he comes now, it will be easier." For a heartbeat, the woman's mouth trembled. Then it set. "He has done nothing wrong." "Few people who are loved have done something wholly wrong to those who love them," Miss Marple said. "That is why love is so inconvenient for the police. Is he here?" A shadow moved in the little parlour behind her, and a young man rose from the hard chair, as if lifted by a string. He was thinner than his aunt's boasts had made him, and handsomer in the way of boys who expect their charm to be greeted with relief. The light coat hung wrong on his shoulders, as if it had been taken from a taller man or a shop door without sizing. "I haven't done anything," he said, before anyone asked. "And I won't go to a station to be made to look as if I had. You can say what you like here." Slack glanced at Miss Marple. She inclined her head almost imperceptibly. "Very well," the inspector said, settling himself as if he had all afternoon. "Why did you visit Lady Averill 2 days before Mr. Pritchard died? And why did the gardener see you by the library wall after dusk?" The young man, Lionel, the L made flesh, lifted his chin. "I went to ask for work. Mr. Denning said there might be some cataloguing, lifting, that sort of thing. I've done storerooms before. I'm neat." "Neatness is a blessing," Miss Marple said placidly. "It keeps one from treading in mess one has made oneself. Was it on Mr. Denning's advice that you tried the side door?" He coloured. "I never touched a side door." "Ah," Miss Marple said, as if she'd thought as much and was disappointed only for his sake. "Then the ladder with paint upon the rung will have to belong to another young man of your build. It is a pity. St. Mary Mead produces few enough that size. Did you sign the visitor's book, dear? Of course, he said too quickly, and then, hearing himself, tried to soften it. I mean, Lady Averill's maid asked me. Slack put the closed book on the table, as though its contents could be inferred through osmosis. Did Mr. Denning give you anything when you left? A pocketbook, perhaps? No, Lionel said. His eyes went to his aunt and stuck there, pleading. He promised he'd speak for me. He said there was money to be made if the sale went through and he'd see me right, that's all. Money to be made often looks like kindness when a man is hungry, Miss Marple said, with no judgment and therefore twice the effect. And men who are between positions, as your aunt so charmingly phrases it, sometimes offer more loyalty than the occasion warrants. You knew about the money order, I think. Mr. Pritchard thought it not quite true. That stung. It was mine, he burst out, the grievance raw. He had no right to say it wasn't. It was owed to me. Well, nearly. A gentleman promised, and then pretended he hadn't. Did Mr. Denning introduce you to this gentleman? Slack asked. Lionel's face closed and opened like a hand. He said names weren't important, only signatures. Names are very important, Miss Marple said softly. More important than signatures. One can be borrowed, the other clings. When you went to the hall, Lionel, did Mr. Denning ask you to fetch anything? A page from a book, perhaps? Something thin and small that would fit in a pocket and feel like triumph until you had to explain it. He stared at her then with the affronted terror of a child caught with jam on its sleeve. He said it was only an old page that didn't matter. He said Mr. Pritchard kept fussy notes he never needed. He said if Lady Averill saw how empty the fund was, she'd sell and he'd look after me. I never thought, no, Miss Marple agreed. You did not. Few boys think when a man with a carnation speaks softly and promises introductions. Her voice remained gentle. And the tea in the vicarage garden. You were there, you know. You kept to the edges. Young men do when they haven't a hat and think it would be noticed. Did you carry a cup along the path? It would have slopped. Cups do. But there were no slops by the trellis, only a very full cup, newly poured. I never poured it, he said fiercely. And for once, the fierceness rang true. I saw Mr. Denning with him by the trellis. I thought they were arguing, but they stopped when Mrs. Ellison came. I didn't touch anything. I swear I didn't touch the tea. Slack's pencil waited over an invisible page. What did you touch? Lionel looked at his hands as if they might answer. The ladder, he said, defeated. I carried it round as Mr. Denning said. And I gave him my coat when his sleeve caught on a nail. He said he couldn't go about torn, that's all. That's often more than enough, Slack said. Miss Marple rose, patting the young man's sleeve as one might to ease a wrinkle. You had better come to the vicarage in the morning, she said, not unkindly. Bring the coat. Bring anything Mr. Denning gave you, even if you think it is nothing. People are saved every day by nothing, if it is the right shape. On the lane back, Slack let out a breath between his teeth. So he took the page, helped Denning to the window, and crept through the tea like a cat by a cream jug. But he didn't poison Pritchard. No, Miss Marple said. He did not. He has not the stillness for it. She glanced toward the churchyard, where evening light lay flat and gold. He is a borrower of courage, not a manufacturer. The digitalis was placed by someone who handles liquid like a language. Mrs. Ellison? She refreshed, she did not seed. Miss Marple's eyes folded a little at the corners. There is a distinction. The bitter must have been in the first mouthful that Mr. Pritchard took alone by the trellis, before the kindness arrived to cover it with fresh. She paused. Who had both reason and the habit? Who would be as invisible near a pot as a chair or a spoon? Not a man, Inspector. Men stand out around tables. A woman. A woman who would rather be thought fussy than false. A woman whose pride had been wounded in a small particular way, and who believed, quite honestly, That a correction by fate is not the same as an act of her own hand. Slack slowed. You can't mean— Not Mrs. Ellison, Miss Marple said. She is defensive, not dangerous. Another. Think, Inspector. Whose cup bore the tidiest rim of jam at the tea? Whose eye judged every pour as if correctness itself were threatened? Who was close to every pot and yet owned none of the decisions they served? They had reached the vicarage gate. Griselda appeared with a question in her eyes and a tray balanced as smoothly as a conclusion. Before anyone could speak, Miss Hart came hurrying along the path, her cap askew, the dutiful anxiety of the conscientious in every line. Miss Marple, I forgot. Silly of me. But at the tea, I did refill a cup. The teapot was heavy, and Mrs. Bantry asked me to help while she fetched more milk. I never do it, you know. I'm always afraid of spilling, but the inspector said to tell anything at all and— Oh, I do hope I haven't made trouble. Miss Marple took the confession as gently as a china lid. Not trouble, dear. Which cup? The one by the scones, Miss Hart said, colouring with the memory of her own bravery. Mr. Pritchard's first cup, I think. He'd left it when he went for his spectacles. It seemed a shame to have it go cold, so I refreshed a little from the pot on the tray nearest the door. Mrs. Bantry keeps the stronger brew on the left, she says, for men who like it. I thought I did right. And then you carried the pot back to the table? Miss Marple asked softly. Oh no, Miss Hart said, almost proud. Mrs. Bantry says never to carry a pot when you can lift a cup. She taught me once, when I first came to the village and spilled on the bishop. You pour where it stands. That's tidier. Miss Marple's hand, very lightly, touched Griselda's sleeve. You see, she said, and the words were not triumph, but a small sorrow for the way people learn. One learns tidiness from those who have most of it to spare. Slack looked at Miss Hart, then at Miss Marple. You think— I think Miss Hart is as innocent as her apron, Miss Marple said. She repeats instructions exactly. That is her virtue. The instruction came from someone who makes rules of small domesticities. Someone who would correct a pour in a burning house. Someone who moved freely between table and door and trellis because she is always moving, always managing. Dolly Bantry is many things, but she is careless with ceremony and careless with guilt. She would have wept and told us by now if she had poured the world wrong. No, this was another woman's kind of order. Griselda's eyes widened slowly. Jane. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. Griselda, my dear, your own careful creed. Never carry a pot when you can lift a cup. And strong brew on the left for the men. And pour where it stands. That's tidier. Principles are a sort of prayer. One says them without knowing. There is one other lady in St. Mary Mead who has trained 3 generations in those exact rules and prides herself on never spilling a drop. The silence reached out and touched the laburnum, the path, the tray in Griselda's hands. Slack's voice, when it came, was almost reluctant. Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple's face was kind, which is not the same as soft. Pritchard's correctness made her furious in ways she would never admit. He blocked her generosity, twice this year. Do you remember, Griselda? The choir robes she wished to buy from her cousin's shop. The special price that was not quite special. The pantry roof she wanted fixed by her favourite handyman who did not submit a tender. Rules, Mrs. Bantry, he said, and she smiled and poured. She loves to manage. Oh, I do not blame her. Managing has saved many parishes. But he was about to tell the garden that her managing had strayed into favour and that he had sent papers to London to stop it. It would have humiliated her before those she leads. Griselda put down the tray very carefully. Dolly would never. She stopped, because St. Mary Mead knows what people will never do until a very particular day. Digitalis is in the border by her drive, Miss Marple went on quietly. She knows it as a plant to admire and to caution. A pinch crushed into the dregs of a cup that is then refreshed leaves a bitterness that hot, strong tea will cover for the first 2 mouthfuls. A full cup, poured where it stands, no slopping, no telltale saucer. because that is tidier. She looked toward the green, as if she could see the past set out again like cups under the chestnut tree. She would tell herself she meant only to quiet him for the afternoon, to avoid a scene. People tell themselves such things, but hearts are not committees, and a pinch may be a cliff. Slack straightened. A man who disliked the path his feet must take, but would take it. I'll fetch her. Wait till morning, Miss Marple said, with the faintest weariness. Let Leonard be with her a little tonight. Pride unmasks worse in the dark than light can soothe. And in the morning we shall have them all at the hall, the trellis, the side door, the pots. Let everything stand where it stood. Those who acted out of calculation and those out of tidiness will reveal themselves where their habits live. Griselda, pale and resolute, nodded. I'll go to her now. She will need a friend who knows her as she is, not as rumours make her. Miss Marple sat at the table after they had gone. The visitor's book closed before her, like a chapter at its penultimate page. Outside, the foxgloves leaned and listened to the slow coming on of night. She thought of cups that had been lifted, and cups that had been refilled, of boys who borrowed coats and men who borrowed courage, of women whose kindness, untended, can turn into the sort of order that brooks no contradiction. The pattern lay almost complete on her lap, like a piece of lace that required only the last loop to fasten it to itself. In the morning, she would ask them all to come to the hall. Lady Averil by the library door, Mrs. Ellison by the rose walk, young Lionel with his too long coat, Mr. Denning with his empty pocketbook, Miss Hart with her careful apron, and Mrs. Bantry under the chestnut shade, her hands as steady as any steward's in England. And there, with the pots and cups, where they had been, she would touch each habit lightly and let it speak. When the last cup had found its place, the truth, which had been standing patient as a chair, would sit down at last. Morning came with a low haze over the green, softening the edges of the cottages and making the church tower seem farther away than it was. Miss Marple had already been at her desk for an hour, writing small, precise notes in her spidery hand, each one an invitation worded so simply that no one could mistake it for anything other than a neighbourly request. By the time Leonard came down from his study, they were all sealed and ready for the errand boy to carry. One to Lady Averil, one to Clara, one to Mrs. Ellison, one to young Lionel, one to Mr. Denning at his lodgings, and one, written last and folded twice before sealing, to Mrs. Bantry. They'll all come? Leonard asked, glancing at the neat pile. They will, Miss Marple said. Curiosity, guilt, or a wish to set the record straight. Each has its lure. And besides, people rarely refuse an old woman when she says she wants to see them about a small matter. By 11 o'clock the hall's long drive was seeing more use than it had in months. Lady Averil arrived in her phaeton, Clara beside her with the reins loosely in hand. Mr. Denning walked up from the village in a dark suit that seemed to have been pressed in an excess of self-assurance. Mrs. Ellison came with her nephew, both a little stiff in their movements. Miss Hart hurried along the gravel, cap askew as usual. And last came Mrs. Bantry, a splash of confident colour in her hat, her manner brisk and smiling, as though the whole business were merely an extension of the church fête. Miss Marple had arranged matters in the garden, under the spreading chestnut, whose shade had covered the tea tables the day of the fête. 2 tables stood much as they had then, set with cups and saucers, a plate of seed cake, a small jar of jam, and 2 teapots, one slightly heavier, the other light and delicate. On the far side, near the path to the rose trellis, a single chair stood beside a table holding an untouched cup, placed just so. I thought, Miss Marple began, once they had all gathered, that it might help us to remember the order of that afternoon. We are so fortunate to have the very setting, and even the weather in something of the same temper. It is surprising how much returns to mind when one stands where one stood before. She directed them gently, placing Lady Averil near the library path, Denning at the seat he had taken with Clara, Mrs. Ellison at the far table where she had presided for part of the tea, and Miss Hart at the edge nearest the house. Lionel was set a little apart, near the place where the ladder had rested against the side wall. Mrs. Bantry took the chair closest to the heavier teapot, her hands resting on the table as though they had never left it. "We shall begin," Miss Marple said, "with the moment when Mr. Pritchard left to fetch his spectacles. His cup, as you see here, was left untouched. And here," she indicated the solitary table by the trellis, "we have the place where he was found. There was, you will recall, a second cup, very full and quite warm." She turned to Miss Hart. "My dear, would you be so good as to show us how you refreshed Mr. Pritchard's first cup, the one at the table?" Miss Hart, a little pink with the attention, took the lighter pot and poured neatly into the cup. "Mrs. Bantry says always to fill it near the brim," she said. "But I was afraid to spill, so I left it just below." "And where was the pot you used?" "On the tray near the house here." Miss Hart gestured to the nearer table. "I didn't move it, of course." Miss Marple nodded. "Quite right. And now, Mrs. Ellison, your turn. Will you show us how you came to take a fresh cup to Mr. Pritchard by the trellis?" Mrs. Ellison hesitated, then rose, taking the heavier pot from the table before her. "It was full. Someone had just filled it. I poured quickly. I've a steady hand, and I didn't want to spill on the gravel." She carried it to the solitary table and set it down. "Like that." "Excellent," Miss Marple said, and for a moment her eyes rested on the angle of Mrs. Bantry's hand against the table. Now, before Mrs. Ellison could have done so, someone must have poured from this pot into another cup, Mr. Pritchard's second. The pot was here, not there, and it was very full. That is not something that happens by chance. It requires a habit of keeping pots at the table and pouring where they stand rather than carrying them. She stepped closer to the heavier pot. "There are 2 people here who have trained others to pour in just that way. Miss Hart learned it from one, and the other, my dear Dolly, is you." The smile on Mrs. Bantry's face did not fade, but it tightened, like a ribbon pulled a little too snug. "My dear Jane, I hardly think—" "You did not mean harm," Miss Marple said gently. "You meant to silence him for the afternoon, to stop what you thought would be an unnecessary scene in front of the whole parish. The digitalis was in the cup before Mrs. Ellison refreshed it. Just enough to slow him, you told yourself. But hearts are not clocks, Dolly. They cannot be wound down and expect to start again." Mrs. Bantry's hands stayed perfectly still on the table, but her eyes moved once to Leonard, who stood a little apart, his face grave. "He would have embarrassed the committee," she said at last, her voice low but steady. "Made it sound as though I were feathering my own nest. You know it wasn't like that, Jane. You know I've given more than I've kept." "I know you have given," Miss Marple said. "And I know that pride in one's giving can be as sharp as pride in one's keeping. Mr. Pritchard had sent papers to London. It would have been public soon enough. You thought to keep the matter within the garden. But a pinch of foxglove in a cooling cup, poured over with strong tea, that is enough for a man whose heart is already worn thin." For a moment, only the sound of a bee among the chestnut flowers filled the air. Then Slack, who had been standing at the edge of the green, stepped forward. "Mrs. Bantry, I'll need you to come with me." She rose without fuss, smoothing her skirt, and looked once at Griselda. "You'll tell them, won't you, that I only meant—" "I'll tell them," Griselda said quietly, though her eyes were bright. When they had gone, the others stood awkwardly in the shaded circle, the cups still on the tables, the jam catching the light. Miss Marple moved to the heavier pot, lifted it, and poured a stream into an empty cup. "You see," she said, almost to herself, "how easily it is done. How tidiness and habit can carry a hand from one motion to the next without thought for the step in between." Lady Averil touched her arm. "You've saved more than the hall today, Miss Marple. You've kept the village from turning itself into a place of whispered suspicions. Better to have the truth, however hard." "Truth," Miss Marple said, "is like strong tea. It can be bitter at first, but it clears the head in the end." She poured the last of the pot away into the grass, the dark liquid seeping into the earth, and the circle slowly broke apart. One by one, they went back toward the drive, their footsteps softened by the chestnut's shade, leaving Miss Marple alone in the garden where the pattern had finally closed. The cups and pots would be carried back to the hall's kitchen, the tables folded away, and the green would forget for a while what had been decided there. But she knew the memory would linger, quiet and unobtrusive, in the way the village poured its tea from that day forward, always just below the brim. The afternoon sun lay warmly over St. Mary Mead, gilding the neat rows of gardens and catching in the window panes of the cottages, as though the village itself were trying to resume its placid routine. Yet for those who had been at the hall that morning, there was a subtle difference in the air, a quietness that was not simply peace, but the settling of something that had been held too long in tension. In the vicarage drawing room, Leonard Clement set aside his sermon notes and looked across at Miss Marple, who sat with her knitting in her lap. "You were right from the beginning, Jane," he said. "It was in the teacup, just as you thought." "I suppose I should stop being surprised by that." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "It wasn't the cup, so much as the hand that poured it. One can hide a page from a ledger. One can even hide a ladder against a wall, but it is much harder to hide a habit. Mrs. Bantry's sense of order is her pride. Pour where it stands, keep the table tidy, fill the cups to the brim. All very good principles, except when one wishes to keep something unsaid." Griselda, who had been unusually quiet since returning from the hall, spoke with a kind of sober loyalty. "She will have a hard time of it, Jane. I don't believe she meant for him to die. But digitalis," Miss Marple finished gently, "is not an herb to be measured in good intentions. It was enough, and on a heart already strained, it was fatal." She told herself it was only to quiet him for the afternoon, to spare the parish an ugly scene. That is often how harm is done, by sparing others the discomfort of truth. Leonard sighed. "And Denning. In the hands of the police," Miss Marple said. "His part was purely gainful, removing the page, hiding the account book, pressing Lady Averil into a quick sale. But without the death, it would have been a matter for the civil courts, not the criminal. Mrs. Ellison's nephew was only a tool in his hand, as he was in hers. They will both, I hope, learn from the brush with consequences." They sat for a moment in companionable quiet, the faint sounds of the village drifting in through the open window, children's voices, a dog barking somewhere far down the lane, the rhythmic clop of a cart on the road. "It will be odd," Griselda said at last, "going to the next parish event without Dolly in command of the tea." Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice. "Perhaps it will be calmer," she said. "Or perhaps someone else will step forward with rules of their own. Villages are like gardens. Remove one strong plant and another will take its place, sometimes more vigorously than before." Later, walking home, Miss Marple passed the green where the chestnut spread its summer shade. She paused, looking at the space where the tables had stood on that fateful afternoon. The place looked entirely ordinary now, as though nothing of consequence had ever happened there. But she knew that in the minds of those who had stood beneath its branches, the memory would linger, not of scandal or shame, but of how quickly the smallest things could turn the course of events. A cup filled too high, a pinch of leaves from a border plant, a hand guided by habit, not malice, yet leading to an end that could not be undone. She walked on, the lace of her knitting folded neatly in her bag, and the warm air carrying the faint scent of roses from the vicarage garden. The case was closed, but the lesson remained, as it always did, stitched quietly into the fabric of village life, ready to be seen by anyone with the patience to look closely enough.